The biggest myth about family is that blood means loyalty. I believed that myth for 68 years. I built my entire life around it. My son took that belief and he put it on a podium in front of 400 people and he auctioned it off for $1. His mother, my wife of 39 years, $1. I was 20 feet away when it happened, close enough to see her face, close enough to watch 39 years of sacrifice get laughed at by the boy we built everything for. I did not move, I did not speak, because 68 years had taught me one thing above everything else. The most powerful thing a man can do is know exactly when to be still. My time was coming, and it came. Before we go any further, subscribe to Revenge Handler. This channel exists for every father and grandfather who gave their best years to this family and got betrayal in return. If that hits close to home, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit subscribe right now, because what I'm about to tell you, you need to hear it all the way through. My name is Gerald. I am 68 years old. My grandchildren call me Pop. The man who humiliated his mother in front of 400 people called me Dad. Get comfortable, because the people in this story had every single chance to do the right thing. They chose wrong every single time. Before we go further, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Make sure you are subscribed. You are going to love it here. And if you think you already know where this is going, you don't, not even close. Let me tell you exactly what that room looked like. The Hargrove Grand Hotel, 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a city laid out below us like something from a dream. My son, Daniel, had rented the entire ballroom for his company's 7th anniversary gala. 7 years in business, fastest-growing logistics firm in the region, 400 guests, investors, clients, board members, the people who had built their careers alongside his, white linen tablecloths, centerpieces I could not name, a bar that had been open since 6, and family. My daughter-in-law, Patricia, seated near the front in a dress that cost more than our first month's rent, my 3 grandchildren beside her, and Margaret, my wife, 39 years. She was at table 7, green dress, the one she had bought on sale and altered herself because the original length was not right. She had tried it on for me the evening before. She had turned around slowly and said, "Gerald, is this too much?" I had looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Maggie, you are the most beautiful woman in any room you have ever walked into." She had waved her hand at me. "You have to say that." I said, "I have never said anything in my life because I had to." She smiled. That specific smile, the one that starts slow and then takes over her whole face. That smile was on her face when Daniel walked to the podium an hour later. It was gone in under 30 seconds. Daniel was magnificent at the podium. I will give him that. He always had been. From the time he was 12 years old and gave a speech at his middle school graduation, he had known how to hold a room. Confident without arrogance, warm without being soft, the kind of speaker who makes every person in the audience feel like they are the only one being spoken to. I had always been proud of that. I had always thought, we gave him that, Margaret and I. The dinner table conversations, the books we pushed him toward, the way we made him articulate himself even when he was angry, especially when he was angry. We built that in him. Standing at that podium, I still believed it. For the first 3 minutes of his speech, I still believed it. He talked about growth, about the team, about what the company had overcome in 7 years. The room was completely with him. Then he said, "Before I go any further, I want to take a moment to honor the people who made me who I am." He looked at Patricia, raised his glass. The room applauded. He looked at his children. More applause. He looked out across the tables. And then he found table 7. He found Margaret. And something shifted in his face, something I did not recognize immediately, a performance within the performance. He leaned into the microphone. He smiled. He said, "And of course, how could we forget my mother?" The room turned toward table 7. Margaret straightened slightly, that instinctive dignity she's always had. Daniel tilted his head. He said, "Mom, stand up." She stood, smoothed her dress, smiled. The room applauded politely. And then Daniel said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do something special tonight in honor of the woman who made the same pot roast every Sunday for 30 years. Laughter from the crowd. Who has never once in her entire life said anything remotely interesting at a dinner table. More laughter, louder. I am officially opening the bidding on One Evening with My Mother. Starting price, $1. The room erupted. Laughter. Glasses raised. Someone near the back shouted, "Sold!" More laughter. Daniel was grinning. Patricia was covering her mouth, smiling. My 3 grandchildren were looking at the floor. And Margaret was still standing, still upright, still dignified. Because that is who she is. That is who she has always been. But her smile, that specific smile, the one that takes over her whole face, was completely gone. What replaced it was something I had only seen once before in 39 years. The night her father died. That specific stillness, that specific distance in the eyes that means a person has gone somewhere inside themselves that no one else can reach. I set my glass down, very carefully, very quietly, and I looked at my son at that podium, still milking the laughter, and I felt something I had never felt before in 68 years of living. Not anger, something colder than anger, something that doesn't have a clean name, something that said, "This is the moment. Everything changes here, right now, in this room." I want to stop here for a second because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, "Gerald, it was just a joke. Fathers and sons do that. It was a roast. He didn't mean it." I hear you, but here's what you didn't see. You didn't see Margaret's face when she sat back down. You didn't see her pick up her water glass with hands that weren't entirely stable. You didn't see her look at me across that room, not for comfort, but with an expression that said, "Please don't." Not, "I'm fine. Please don't." She was protecting him, even then, even in that moment. She was protecting the boy who had just put a price on her in front of 400 people. 39 years of marriage taught me to read every version of my wife's face, and that face, in that moment, was the face of a woman who had been embarrassed before. Not the first time, the first time. I did not react that night, not visibly. I finished my water. I smiled at the right moments. I shook hands at the end of the evening. I helped Margaret with her coat. We rode down in the elevator with Daniel and Patricia. Daniel clapped me on the shoulder in the lobby. He said, "Good night, Dad. Mom, you were a great sport." Margaret smiled, said, "Good night, sweetheart." We walked to the car. I opened her door. She got in. I walked around to the driver's side. I got in. I started the engine, and Margaret looked straight ahead through the windshield and said, "Gerald, don't." I said, "Okay," and I drove. 22 minutes home. Neither of us spoke. I pulled into the driveway. She was inside before I turned off the engine. I sat in the car for a long time. I looked at the house we had lived in for 31 years. The house we had painted ourselves, the garden Margaret had built from scratch in the first spring, the porch light she always left on, the boy learning to ride a bike in this driveway. I thought about driving that same boy to his first job interview. I thought about dancing with Margaret in the kitchen on a Tuesday night for absolutely no reason except a song came on the radio and she reached for my hand. And I thought about her face in that ballroom, that specific stillness, that specific distance in the eyes that means a person has gone somewhere inside themselves that no one else can reach. And I said out loud, to nobody, in a car, in a driveway at 11:40 at night, no. Just that one word, no. And I went inside. That night, after Margaret was asleep, I went to my desk. I opened a legal pad, and I started writing. Not a letter, not a list of grievances, a record. Because something told me this was not the first time, and something told me the stranger in the back of that ballroom, the one who stood up, the one whose 4 words I never forgot, was going to be the most important part of it. I just needed to find...
If you were just joining, you need to go back and watch from the start. Because what I'm about to tell you only makes sense if you know what came before. We left off at a gala, a podium, a microphone, $1, and a stranger in the back of a room who stood up and said 4 words that I have never forgotten. But before I tell you what those words were, I need to tell you what I found out in the days after, because the gala, as devastating as it was not the whole story. It was not even close to the whole story. And what I discovered in the week that followed made that podium moment look like the smallest part of something much larger, much darker, much more deliberate. The morning after. I woke up at 4:51, before the alarm, before the birds, before any sound in the house at all. Margaret was still asleep. I watched her for a moment. The way she was breathing, the way her hand was curled near her face. 39 years, and I still thought, how did I get here? How did I get to be the man who wakes up next to this woman? I got up quietly, made coffee, sat at my desk, opened the legal pad, and I started writing everything I remembered from the night before. Not from anger, from discipline. When you spend 30 years in construction, you learn that the most important thing about any structure is the documentation. What went in, what was used, what was promised, what was delivered. I was documenting my son. And what I wrote that morning, in the quiet of 4:51 a.m., filled 6 pages. But there was something I could not write down yet, because I did not have it yet. The stranger, the man in the back of the room, he had stood up, slowly, deliberately, at the moment Daniel said $1. He had not shouted, had not made a scene. He had simply stood and said 4 words, quietly enough that only the people nearest him heard. But the people nearest him heard clearly. And the ripple of what he said moved through that room like a stone dropped in still water. By the time it reached the front, where Daniel was still grinning at the microphone, something had shifted. The laughter had changed texture. Some people were no longer laughing. Some people were looking at each other. Some people were looking at Margaret. Daniel had felt it. I had watched his eyes scan the room, recalibrate, move on. But I had also watched him find the stranger in the back row, and I had watched something, just for a fraction of a second, cross my son's face. Recognition. He knew that man. Who was the stranger? I found out on a Thursday, 3 days after the gala. I had made some calls, quietly, methodically, the way I do everything. His name was Robert Cahill, 64 years old, semi-retired, former venture capitalist, one of the most respected in the region's business community for the better part of 2 decades. He had stepped back from active investing 18 months prior, but his name still carried weight, significant weight, the kind of weight that made people return calls within the hour. Robert Cahill had been at the gala as a guest of Daniel's board members. He had not been specifically invited by Daniel. He had come as a courtesy appearance, the kind of thing men like Cahill do when they want to stay connected to the current of things without being fully in the water. He had been seated at a table near the back of the room. He had watched the whole speech, and when Daniel had said $1 for my boring mom, Robert Cahill had stood up, and he had said, "That woman raised your company." 4 words. That woman raised your company. Quietly, without performance, without aggression. Just stated. Like a fact. Because it was. The people at his table heard it. The people adjacent heard it. And the ripple, the shift in the room, was Robert Cahill's 4 words landing on people who knew they were true. Right now, drop a comment. Tell me, have you ever had someone stand up for you when you could not stand up for yourself? Because Robert Cahill did not know Margaret. He did not know me. He owed us nothing, and he stood up anyway. Type Cahill in the comments if you believe there are still people like this left in this world. Because there are. I know. I met one. What Cahill did next. 2 days after I learned his name, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. The voice was calm, measured. The kind of voice that had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word cost millions. He said, "Mr. Gerald, my name is Robert Cahill. I believe we were both at the Hargrove Gala last week. I hope you'll forgive me for calling. I got your number from a mutual contact. I was hoping we might meet." I said, "Mr. Cahill, I know who you are. I was wondering how long it would take you to call." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're sharper than your son gives you credit for." I said, "Most people are." He said, "Can you meet me tomorrow? There is something you need to know about your son, about his company, about what has been happening for the past 18 months. I said, "Name the place." The meeting. We met at a coffee shop 12 blocks from my house. Nothing fancy. A corner table, 2 coffees. Robert Cahill was a compact man, gray at the temples, good handshake, eyes that assessed without being unkind, the kind of man who had seen enough to not be surprised by much. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke. Then he said, "I want to start by saying, what your son did at that gala was one of the most tone-deaf things I have witnessed in 30 years of attending these events, and I have witnessed considerable tone deafness." I said, "I appreciate that, but I suspect that is not why you called me." He almost smiled. "No, it is not." He wrapped both hands around his coffee. He said, "I know your son, Gerald. Not personally, professionally. I've been watching his company for about 2 years. I was approached 14 months ago about making a significant investment." I said, "And?" He said, "And I declined. Because during my due diligence, I found something that concerned me considerably." I looked at him. He looked at me. He said, "Your son has been representing his company's growth to potential investors using figures that do not align with the actual financials." I sat with that. "You are telling me my son is misrepresenting his numbers?" Cahill said, "I am telling you what my due diligence found 14 months ago. I am telling you that I chose not to invest and moved on. But last week, at that gala, I watched him perform for a room of people who are currently invested based on those same numbers." He paused, and I watched him put his mother up for auction for a laugh. And something told me, you needed to know what I know.
I want to stop here because I know what this sounds like. It sounds like a stranger walking into your life with accusations about your son. And I want to tell you, that is exactly what I thought in that first moment. I'm a father. Before I am anything else, I'm a father. My first instinct was not to believe it. My first instinct was to defend Daniel, to find the explanation, the misunderstanding, the version of this that made my son something other than what Cahill was describing. I sat at that table for a long moment. Then I asked him one question. Do you have documentation? He reached into his jacket. He put a manila folder on the table. He slid it across to me. He said, I kept copies. I keep copies of everything. 30 years in venture capital teaches you that. I opened the folder. I read for a long time. Cahill drank his coffee, did not rush me, did not speak. When I finished, I closed the folder. I looked at the table for a moment. Then I looked at him. I said, how many investors? He said, currently, based on the Gala guest list, I counted at least 11 people in that room who are likely invested at levels between $200,000 and $1.4 million. I said, and the actual numbers, the real ones, how far off are they? Cahill said, far enough that if the right person asked the right questions, the answers would be very difficult for your son to provide. I did not go home and confront Daniel. I know that is what you would expect. I know that is what most men would do. Drive to his son's office, put the folder on the desk to...
Still with me? Good, because this is where everything changes. We left off with Carter Rhodes picking up the phone to call Robert Cahill. 2 men, both careful, both documented, both ready. And my son, still at his desk, still running his company, still telling his story to people who believed him, had absolutely no idea what was being assembled 3 miles away from everything he had built. That is the thing about quiet men. We do not announce what we are doing. We just do it. And by the time the other person realizes something is happening, it is already done. The Thursday meeting. Carter's office, 9 in the morning, 3rd floor, corner room, the kind of office that has seen 30 years of people's worst moments and helped them survive anyway. Carter, me, Robert Cahill, Dr. Sandra Osei, 4 people around a conference table, coffee that nobody touched. Carter opened the folder. He laid everything out in the order it needed to be heard. Cahill's original due diligence, Dr. Osei's preliminary assessment, the documentation I had compiled, dates, conversations, patterns, and then, at the end, the legal pad, my legal pad, 31 years of observations about my son. Carter looked at it. He said, Gerald, what is this exactly? I said, that is everything I noticed and chose not to say for 31 years, because he was my son, and I gave him grace every time he needed it, and sometimes he didn't. Carter looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, can I keep this? I said, that is why I brought it. Dr. Osei speaks. Dr. Sandra Osei was a small woman with enormous precision, the kind of professional who says exactly what she means and nothing more. She opened her own folder. She said, I will be direct. The financial representations made to investors in Daniel Webb's company over the past 22 months contain material discrepancies. These are not accounting errors. Errors are random. These discrepancies follow a pattern. They consistently present the company's revenue position as stronger than the underlying data supports. In 3 instances, the numbers presented in investor materials cannot be reconciled with the operational financials by any standard accounting methodology I am aware of. She closed her folder. She looked around the table. In plain language, The investors were shown a version of this company that does not exist. Cahill nodded slowly, like a man hearing confirmed what he had suspected for 14 months. Carter made a note. I looked at the table, at the wood grain, at my own hands on it, the hands that had built things, carried things, fixed things, the hands that had clapped my son on the shoulder at his college graduation. I looked at those hands for a long moment. Then I looked up. I said, "What are the options?" The options. Carter laid them out, methodical, sequential, no editorializing. He said, "Option 1, we do nothing. We have documentation, we hold it, we wait and see if Daniel corrects the discrepancies on his own timeline. This protects the family from any association with the outcome. It also means 11 investors continue in a situation they do not have full information about." He paused. Option 2, I contact Daniel directly, present the documentation, give him the opportunity to self-correct, to go to his investors, disclose the discrepancies, work out a remediation plan. This gives him the window to be the man you raised him to be. It also gives him the window to cover his tracks if he chooses to. Another pause. Option 3, we provide the documentation anonymously to the appropriate regulatory body. The SEC has jurisdiction if interstate investors are involved. The State Securities Commission has jurisdiction regardless. The investigation happens without our fingerprints on the trigger. The outcome is not in our control. He looked at me. Option 4, Robert. He looked at Cahill. Cahill leaned forward slightly. He said, "I know most of the investors in that room, personally. I have relationships that go back 20 years with 3 of them specifically. If I were to have individual conversations about the importance of asking certain specific questions at their next board interaction," he let that sit, "questions that any sophisticated investor should be asking anyway, questions that the current financial presentation would not be able to answer. The investigation would come from within the room, from the people who have every right to ask those questions, without any external trigger that could be traced." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then I said, "Which option protects the investors most completely?" Carter said, 3 or 4. I said, "Which option gives Daniel the last possible chance to be honest?" Carter said, 2. I said, "Which option does Margaret sleep best with?" Nobody answered that, because they all knew it was a question for no one in that room but me. I sat with it for a long time. I thought about a boy on a bike in a driveway. I thought about a broken window. I thought about a man who comes forward is always treated better than a man who gets caught. I said, "We start with option 2. I talk to Daniel. I give him 1 week, 7 days. In that time, he goes to his investors himself and begins the process of correcting what he has misrepresented." I looked at Cahill. If he does not, Robert has those conversations. Cahill nodded. And if the conversations don't produce the right questions? I looked at Carter. Carter looked at Dr. Ossie. Dr. Ossie said, "Then the documentation goes to the State Securities Commission with my signature on it, and mine is a signature they take seriously. Right now, I need you to drop a comment. Tell me, would you have given your son that 1 week, or would you have gone straight to option 3? Because that question kept me up for 3 nights straight. Type 1 week or straight to 3 in the comments right now. I want to know." The drive to Daniel's office. I called Daniel the morning after the meeting. I told him I needed to see him in person at his office. He said, "Dad, I have a full day." I said, "Daniel, I am not asking." Silence. Then, 11 o'clock. I said, "I will be there at 10:30. I had been to Daniel's office 4 times in 7 years. Each time, he had given me the tour, the growing team,
the expanding floor plan, the wall of client logos in the lobby. Each time, I had been proud, genuinely, completely. This time, I sat in the lobby and looked at that wall of logos, and I thought about what they represented to the people who had funded the infrastructure that attracted them. And I thought about what they actually represented once the real numbers were laid alongside the story. Daniel came out at 10:32, pressed shirt, good handshake, the professional ease he had always had. He said, "Dad, good to see you. Come on back." I followed him, past the open floor plan, past the glass offices, past the people who looked up and smiled at the founder's father walking through, into the corner office, the good one, city view, leather chairs, a desk that had not come cheap. He gestured to a chair. I sat. He sat across from me. He said, "So, what's going on?" The conversation. I put the folder on his desk. I did not open it. I just placed it and watched his eyes. They went to the folder, stayed there for a moment, came back to me. He said, "What is that?" I said, "That is a preliminary assessment of the discrepancies between your investor presentations and your actual financial position, prepared by a forensic accountant with 30 years of experience in exactly this kind of analysis." He did not move. I said, "I also have Robert Cahill's due diligence from 14 months ago when he declined to invest, and his notes on why he declined." Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, just enough for a father who had watched that jaw for 31 years to see it. He said, "Gerald, where did you get—" I said, "It does not matter where I got it. What matters is that I have it, and that 11 people who were in that boardroom last week do not." Silence, long enough to have weight. Then Daniel said, "This is more complicated than it looks." I said, "It always is. That is what people say when they need more time to construct the explanation." He looked at me. Something moved across his face. Not anger. Something younger than anger. Something I had not seen since he was 8 years old, standing in a kitchen next to a broken window. I said, "Daniel, I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it the way I raised you to answer things. Directly, honestly, without the version you would give an investor." He said nothing. I said, "Did you knowingly misrepresent your company's financial—"
You stayed. Good. Because this, right here, is why patience is a weapon. We left off at midnight. A text message. 3 words. Make the call. Carter had his instructions. Cahill had his relationships. Dr. Osei had her signature, and Daniel had his silence. He had been given 7 days to be the man I raised him to be. He had chosen a different man entirely. So now, it was my turn. And I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. Everything that followed, every consequence, every outcome, every moment of reckoning, was not something I did to my son. It was something he built himself, brick by brick, choice by choice. I just stopped standing in front of it. 8 a.m. Carter made the call at 8:03. Not to the Securities Commission, not yet. To Robert Cahill. The protocol was exactly what we had agreed in that conference room. Cahill would reach out, personally, quietly, to 3 specific investors, men he had known for decades, men who had every right, every professional obligation to ask the questions that the current financial presentation could not answer. Not an accusation, a conversation. "Robert, I've been looking at some numbers from Web Logistics. Have you had a chance to ask about the Q3 reconciliation? Because I looked at the methodology and I had some questions." That was all it needed to be. Because sophisticated investors, when a man like Robert Cahill asks a quiet question, they ask their own questions very quickly after. The first domino. By 10:30 that morning, Daniel's phone was ringing. I know this because Carter told me. Carter had a contact on Daniel's board, a man who had nothing to do with the financial discrepancies and everything to do with the governance of a company he had invested his reputation in. That board member called Carter at 10:47. He said, "Carter, I don't know what is happening, but I am getting calls from 3 investors simultaneously asking questions about our Q3 numbers that I cannot answer. I need to know if you know something I should know." Carter said, "I think you should call an emergency board meeting, today if possible. And I think you should ask Daniel to bring the original financial models, not the investor presentations, the originals." The board member was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Carter, how bad is it?" Carter said, "That depends entirely on what Daniel does in the next 4 hours." Here is what was happening on Daniel's end during those 4 hours. I did not know it in real time. I found out afterward, piece by piece, from sources I will not name because they trusted me with it. But I want you to understand what those 4 hours looked like from inside Daniel's office. His phone was ringing. His assistant was fielding calls she did not know how to field. Patricia was not answering his texts. His 2 business partners, the men who had started this with him, were standing in his office asking questions he had never prepared for. And somewhere in that chaos, he called me. The call. My phone rang at 11:19. Daniel. I answered on the 3rd ring. He said, "Dad." Just that, one word, the way he used to say it when he was small and something had gone wrong and he needed me to fix it. I said, "I'm here." He said, "It's happening." I said, "I know." He said, "The board, Cahill, the investors, how did they—" He stopped. He already knew. He said, "You did this." I said, "Daniel, you did this. The moment you adjusted the first number, the moment you chose the story over the truth, I simply stopped protecting you from it." Silence. Long. Heavy. Then he said, "What do I do?" And I heard it, under the question, the thing that had been there since he was 8 years old, standing next to a broken window. Not strategy, not calculation. Fear. Real fear. The fear of a man who is run out of road and is finally standing at the edge of what he built and seeing it clearly for the first time. I said, "You call your partners into your office. You tell them everything, all of it. Then you call an all-hands with the board. You bring the real numbers. You bring an independent auditor. Carter will send you the name. And you stand in front of the people who trusted you, and you tell them the truth, every word of it, without the reframe, without the narrative restructure, without the version that makes you look better." He said, "They will pull their investments." I said, "Some will, and they will have every right to." He said, "The company could—" "Daniel, listen to me. Are you listening?" He said, "Yes." I said, "A company can survive a founder who made mistakes and came clean. It cannot survive a founder who was investigated and caught. Those are 2 different stories. Only one of them has a chapter 2. You decide which story you are going to be." Long silence. Then, "Will you come? To the board meeting? I need—" He stopped. I said, "What do you need, Daniel?" He said very quietly, "I need my dad." 68 years, 31 of them being this man's father. I looked at my legal pad, at 31 years of the things I had noticed and chosen not to say. At the broken window, the double shifts, the $40,000, the $1. I looked at all of it, and I said, "I will be there at 2 o'clock. And Daniel, yeah? Wear the plain suit, not the expensive one. Today is not a performance. Today is to truth. Dress like it. Before I tell you what happened in that boardroom, drop a comment. Would you have gone? If your son had done everything mine had done, would you have walked into that room beside him? Type, "I'd go" or "I'd stay home" in the comments right now. Because that decision cost me something I am still paying. But I made it because of something Margaret said to me on the 5th night. Whatever you do, do it because it is right. Not because of the gala, not because of $1, because it is right. I went because it was right. 2 p.m. Web Logistics, conference room, 8th floor. 12 people around the table. The 3 partners, 5 board members, 2 investors who had insisted on being present, Carter sitting beside me, and Daniel. Standing at the head of the table, plain suit. He had listened. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not physically, something else. The performance was gone. All of it. The polish, the ease, the man who could hold a room. What was left was just a man, 31 years old, standing in front of the people he had misled and his father, and trying to find the version of himself that knew how to do this. He looked at me once before he started. I gave him nothing back. Not coldness, just steadiness. I'm here. Do the right thing. I'm here. He looked back at the room. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through it before anyone responds, because it is not easy to say, and I'm going to say it anyway." Nobody spoke. He said, "The financial representations in our last 3 investor packages do not accurately reflect the company's actual position. The discrepancies were deliberate. They were my decisions. My partners did not know. The board did not know. The fault is mine and mine alone." The room was completely silent. He said, "I have asked Carter Rhodes to recommend an independent auditor. I am committing today, in this room, in front of all of you, to full disclosure, real numbers, real position, a remediation plan built on what is actually there, not on what I wanted you to believe was there." He looked around the table. "Some of you are going to want to pull out. That is your right. I'm not going to fight it. I'm not going to restructure the narrative. You will get the real numbers, and you will make real decisions based on them. That is what you always deserved. I'm sorry it took me this long to give it to you." He sat down. The room was silent for a long moment. Then one of the board members, a woman named Elaine, who had been on the board from the beginning, looked at Daniel for a long time. Then she looked at me. She said, "Gerald, did you know?" I said, "I found out 10 days ago." She said, "And you came today?" I said, "He's my son. What he did was wrong. What he is doing right now is right. I will stand beside the second thing. I cannot stand beside the first thing." She looked at me for another long moment. Then she looked back at Daniel. She said, "Let's see the real numbers." What happened in that room? The independent audit was completed 6 weeks later. The real numbers were presented